The reason why I say that is because when it comes down to it, we learned how to dress, we learned how to talk, and we learned the ideas of the culture from it being presented in media back to us. Mm-hmm. We weren't necessarily in there. Yeah. Like when I was super young, I was listening to WBLS and Cool DJ Red Alert is playing it, right? But when I became, when I'm 13, 14 and I'm trying to figure out how to sag or trying to figure out what's cool, it's because of The Source. It's because of Yo MTV Raps. Yeah. It's because of, larger media corporations selling me this idea, or at least opening up the world and showing me what this is. And so when I talk about it, turning it back on ourselves, it's because the reality is our connection is still filtered through the lens of these same sort of corporations that we're talking about. Let's get it started.
Double O.
Think like a rapper.
Check, 1 2 1 2. This is Double O. It's episode 103 of Think Like a Rapper. Because of social media and the instant opinion cycle, there's been a lot of conversations that seem to consistently come up. One of those being of the famed two words, cultural appropriation. I've always felt very weary of this conversation because as much as I consider myself part of hip-hop culture, I do know that inherently a lot of what I learned was filtered through media that was presented to me and not necessarily something that happened on the ground that I myself or my crew invented. So I wanted to explore that along with a bunch of other conversations with my guest today, Jayson Rodriguez. He is a journalist and content editor. He's worked at XXL, Vibe, MTV, Revolt, most recently Vivo. And we've always been good at having water cooler conversations about hip hop. And this podcast actually spawned from some conversations on Twitter regarding who would be best suited to helm the next reign and hopefully resurgence of Def Jam. So again, we talk about the cultural appropriation conversation, talk about who should helm the new legacy of hip-hop's most storied label, and the responsibility of journalists as gatekeepers within the corporate structure, and how they present the culture back to us. Jayson Rodriguez, Think Like a Rapper. Check, 1 2 1 2. You're back.
Hey.
Ad-libs, huh? You are back with Double O, and this is Think Like a Rapper, the podcast. And I'm here with my man Jayson Rodriguez in the burbs of dirty Jersey, man.
Hey, all right. You see, I'm dropping ad-libs because I'm trying to think like a rapper. I'm trying to get in that space, even though we in the burbs, out here looking at trees and grass.
However, this is actually a hilarious place to start. Some of our favorite rappers are from the suburbs.
Yes, facts, big facts.
And this might be a heavy question, but let's jump into it. I spent my formative years in Central Jersey. Mm-hmm. You were in Delaware. When people spend so much time arguing now, I think about cultural appropriation. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about sort of kind of this idea that, you can't do the thing because you didn't create it and people are taking it and, whatever. And I've always felt very sensitive to that because, especially as it relates to hip hop, none of us were there when it was created. Mm-hmm. And it is essential that it propagates because it can make it to places like this. Right. And have kids who are, I'm sure you and I are in a similar space where it's like, you might have heard some of it on a radio, but it really connects when you see the visual and and the fantasy basically idea and the music at the same time, and trying to emulate that. I would say we both consider ourselves part of the culture, obviously, because we've made it behind the wizard's curtain. But where do you feel like you ever have to square anything like that as it relates to those sort of conversations? Because, you're not from a place that necessarily is known for rap, but at the same time, you are just as much a part of the culture as I think.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Most people probably actually think I'm from Brooklyn because I've been up here so long. And my crew's from Brooklyn. No, but I think right, like the genesis of hip hop had a lot to do with like socioeconomic forces in New York, right? And it's a very New York thing, and that's why New York feels so much ownership towards it, and also kind of this voice to deem what's real and what's not, which becomes like another debate that you can have for other reasons, but. To your point, like, right, it has to propagate and grow, and also like exponentially so, in a way where you get a movement in St. Louis, where you get like a Nelly, right, where you get the West Coast, and you kind of get all these things. And I think like if you remove like the socioeconomic things that were happening in the Bronx in the 70s, that's kind of like our big boom. Right, where it's like it's hard to explain. It's just kind of the science of something that happened where Herc took out these speakers and went to the park, and like big boom hip hop, right? And then from there, you just have kind of like the remains and the particles that are just going out into outer space, and what you grab with that particle becomes what it is in your scene, in your town, and where you're from. And I think whether you're wearing, and it's funny, right? Like pre-internet, it was fascinating because it was such distinctions with what you did with like the particles that arrived in your town, right? Like the fragments, where in the West Coast you're wearing Dickies and Chucks, DC, you're wearing like Guess jeans and
New
like
Balance
and New Balance, right? Or and Philly, you got the banged out beards with the dye, and everybody has their own slang. Florida, dreads, and that was kind of fascinating as the internet has kind of created a through line right now where regionally things aren't as distinctive. You can really kind of, some people complain about that, right? Everything's kind of like the same, or there's a monotony to things. But also, I think what's fascinating is like the roots are kind of like similar, right? Like things take off because it's coded, like hip hop is coded language that you're speaking to your man. Yeah. Right? Inside jokes that that become big. And it's fascinating when a new scene comes on the table, and then people are like, oh yeah, that's what they say in Toronto because Drake says this, but it may not be Toronto. He's just the most popular act from there, and he's saying it to his man, and so now everybody's like, oh yeah, Toronto, it's the Six. We all call it the Six. Meanwhile, you speak to people from Toronto, and they're like, what the fuck is the Six? We never call it that shit. So I think it's fascinating. So for me personally, I never kind of had to reconcile that because I Philly kind of had its scene, which kind of influence where I was from because I didn't grow up that far. Like to your point, you said Central Jersey. I'm from Northern Delaware, so really close to Philly. So you have that, and the rest is just, kind of, your friends and what you're connecting with. And then obviously like the shadow of New York loomed large where I was from. So I had a taste for like, mid 90s East Coast aesthetic, MCs, certain type of drum sound. So, I felt very attached to kind of that because I wasn't so far from it. But I think the way that it evolved is too strong of a word because I was close to it. Like, right, like I'm like Delaware's close enough to New York. Yeah, I'm close enough in age to like they're not the originators aren't so far in age from me. So it's just kind of like a ripple. You know, like I'm like a ripple away, still. But yeah, it still feels. Now I'm gonna get in trouble when I say still feels genuine. When genuine is relative, so to speak. Yeah, no, it's just such an interesting thing. And the reason why I brought it up is because obviously you coming from journalism in hip hop, so much of some of these conversations now, and it is because of social media, and it is because, so I have this, back it up, I have this thesis that like, because hip hop was created in New York, because of the kind of place that New York is, it created this perfect package of an idea because of all the things influence, right? You talk about Herc. So you have this entire Caribbean
this Black Caribbean population, plus all the Latin American population, it infuses so many things, obviously American influence as well, but it makes it so easy to port, right? I mean, I think we've seen since, we came up in it that you can take it and put it in Compton, put it in St. Louis, put it in Cuba, put it in France. Mm-hmm. And it's like, you open up the box and it's like, okay, these are the things to make it hip hop. Cool. Now I'm going to morph it into this thing. And now you have this entire scene that can explode from it. And to me, that's what's made it the strongest, I think, sort of cultural export from America in a long time. But
I would say ever.
I would argue as well, ever. But at the same time, now you have, it's been out so long that you see remnants of it. I'll be at the, in line at LAX or something like that. And you'll have two, 18-year-old girls from Orange County that'll be in, having a conversation. And, they'll be using language that we've grown up with as hip hop, but they'll just use it as if it just is. Right. And that the connection isn't being made, that this thing goes back to this sort of core. But I love seeing that. I think it's just always weird to me when people want to really jump on and I get it, there's sensitive things where it does matter, but when people start talking about cultural appropriation, they never turn it on themselves. And it's just like, Atlanta runs shit, but you guys weren't there at the beginning. So if all of a sudden you're talking about, well, this person shouldn't be doing it, well, then where does that place you, or where does that place you in, in the Midwest, when at the end of the day, this core thing starts here and then snowballs into all these different.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because it reminds me a little bit of what was happening with like the Renegade dance and like Shorty and the NBA All-Star Weekend, right? Yeah. And it's this idea that like or to your example with those two girls in Orange County, it's when the leaves blow so far off from the tree and the branches, sometimes it's hard to figure out like where did it originate from. Yeah. And so in some ways that does bother me. And the Renegade dance and Shorty from NBA All-Star Weekend, that bothered me a lot, right? Because it's something that she created. And obviously like there's also, there's like the innovator's curse or dilemma, right? You innovate and, you get like token props, whereas like the person who accelerated it gets like actual tokens of like money, right? Mm-hmm. And with the Renegade dance, like, Shorty created it. And she didn't have like a meager following. She has a nice following too, but the accelerant was like the white girl who's on TikTok and it exploded. And it bothered me that she got the opportunity, right? And I wasn't bothered at the girl. The girl did nothing wrong. Yeah. In the same way that like those two girls from Orange County, right? Like it's cool, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's a purity of emotion for them identifying what they think is cool. Right. And whether they'll find out and kind of be anthropological and go and find the roots of it, that's asking a lot. But for somebody like the NBA or the sponsors who are booking and doing money, this is my thing. More and more people who are in those suits are starting to look like us because they're coming from our age, 100%. Or even if they're like white dudes, they grew up listening to like Tribe Called Quest, right? Yeah. And so it's like they know that things are layered and they know about like an originator versus an accelerator. And so I get bothered when they see something like, oh, this is cool, and don't say like, oh, well, where did it stem from? And at that point, like if you want to be a brand and get into the culture, do something really cool and unite the two girls for the first time, right? Because in the interview with the New York Times, and I'm like shooting myself in the
we'll put her name in the notes. It'll be fine.
But she was like, she wasn't mad, right? She's like, I like that it got popular. I'd like to meet the girl who did it, right? Like she had an innocence of just wanting to meet that girl. That was her next rung on the ladder, not like, let me get this bag. And so I get mad that like, a brand won't connect it.
Did you see, you saw the video, they just did it all together?
So ultimately like once Black Twitter kind of had the uproar, like day 2 or day 3, somebody flew her out and then she got busy during All-Star Weekend. And now the two girls have gotten together, which is dope. And so my whole point of that, it's like, with the culture, again, it flies so far off the leaf and it's kind of hard to find the thing, but it doesn't make it impossible. And it also doesn't make an excuse not to do that work. And I think that's the thing that like we complain, and maybe it's like the point of what you're saying, because I was going to ask you what you meant by like turning it on ourselves with appropriation, but it's we have to create those links, right? They're so easy to fall apart, especially now with technology when it's really hard to sleuth and find things. But it doesn't mean that there's not an excuse to do that work, and the power that it makes for that moment when they connected those two girls.
So there are three places I want to go. I'm going to answer the appropriation things first, and then I actually want to go. Okay. I'm just figuring out which way I want to go. So to answer what you were just saying, the reason why I say that is because when it comes down to it, we learned how to dress, we learned how to talk, and we learned the ideas of the culture from it being presented in media back to us. Mm-hmm. We weren't necessarily in there. Like when I was super young, I was listening to WBLS and Cool DJ Red Alert is playing it, right? But when I became, when I'm 13, 14 and I'm trying to figure out how to sag or trying to figure out what's cool, it's because of The Source. It's because of Yo MTV Raps. Yeah. It's because of, larger media corporations selling me this idea, or at least opening up the world and showing me what this is. And so when I talk about it, turning it back on ourselves, it's because the reality is our connection is still filtered through the lens of these same sort of corporations that we're talking about. And so we're still being sold a product. We bought into it. And to a certain extent, in our little cliques and in our little neighborhoods, it became its own different little sort of things. There were things happening on the ground. There was also the media sort of ways that moved around, whether it be like cassette tapes, trading, and all that stuff.
Yeah, peer-to-peer. The original peer-to-peer.
Exactly. The original word-of-mouth peer-to-peer, or you getting clowned because you didn't have the right, weren't wearing your pants right, or the cultural sort of things that happen. But I'm always weary when we hold culture really, really tight first. And who decides who can hold that really, really tight, because nobody actually was really around, let's say, to have those sort of, they didn't invent it to begin with. So that's kind of when I often wonder why people don't sort of turn it on themselves, in that saying that, like, you didn't make it either. This is something that you inherited from a generation or two or three before. And you decided you decided it fits me because whatever, but you're now telling that next person over there, oh, it doesn't fit you though, because I'm making a judgment call on, and so on, what that is. So that's kind of what I meant by that. But the other two things were, when we talk about the appropriation thing, or we talk about the innovator's dilemma, do you not take issue with it when people within the culture do it? Because so many of our stars aren't necessarily innovators. They're really amazing curators, and they recognize what's happening in a scene and can pull the things from that will then make it scale and make it broad. And this is something we accept, and we know it happens all the time. But do you not take issue with that then, even though it,
It's interesting. I don't know. I don't know if it's naive of me to think that there's a romance when it happens internally versus like when it happens externally. That there's a care for it. That's not always the case. Obviously, there's exceptions to the rule. And a lot of this comes from like the Drake conversations, right? When you talk about like, oh, well, Drake's in London now, or he's doing West Indian Drake now, or Dominican Drake. Yeah. But I think, and there's a lot of people, I don't want to single out to him. He's obviously the biggest one, so he's the bullseye. It makes it easier for him. But whether it's like what Gold Link was doing with his last album, or things that I like to use like Bad Bunny and J Balvin too, because they rap, right? Yeah. And to your point earlier, like it's the genesis of the box that you can kind of port from place to place. It was Black and Latin, and so they're rapping just in Spanish. But I think you can kind of see the pathways that they bring with them when they're doing it, and even if they're not explicitly doing it, you can find ways to trace it back easier. Where when it happens externally. I don't think they can follow the lineage as much. And that's when it kind of really seems broken.
But because we can play inside baseball a little bit, how many young rappers that had a unique style that got around an established rapper, and that established rapper was like, thank you for this style. And now I'm gone.
I'll lift this flow for a second.
And that person never got to scale to any sort of, standpoint. Like that happens often.
A lot,
Yeah.
But I mean, again, inside of baseball, like it's funny. I don't want to be flippant with it, but like that's the music industry. But there's examples of that through rock, through R&B, through pop, through hip hop, and that's it's fine. Again, like I don't want to be like tough break and have people like come at me being like, damn, like you were just cold. But there is, in some regard, like you kind of have to be protective of that because this is business, and that's the thing that gets so frightening about hip hop. And it's funny, I wrote a piece recently about Loud 25 at Radio City Music Hall for Variety, and what I liked about Loud, it reminded me a lot of Def Jam, and I know we're going to talk about Def Jam later, and I'm not doing that to say it's a bridge, but Loud and Def Jams were like hip hop label propers, whereas most of the time they're crews, right? Like Bad Boy is kind of a crew, Rockefeller was a crew, No Limit was a crew, and that's what makes the differences that happens within those crews so bad because they're so personal, right? Where it's like you've done me wrong with business, but like I'm hurt. Right, I'm personally hurt too, which they don't say it in that regard, but from the way that they're attacking the other person, it's more than just a financial hit that's been taken, right? Whether it's Game and 50 Cent, et cetera. And so, because of that closeness in what we do, there's the threat to really get kind of hurt, and you get robbed in a way that's, you can't replace it by just getting the money back, and that's kind of what happens in those opportunities. And so, it's like, I don't know if I have like an explicit like opinion of it. Like it happens and it sucks and it's bad. And, but I think it's funny. I like the idea, like with journalism and gatekeeping and curation, right? Like so obviously like when things were opening up with social media, and I was at outlets who were trying to figure it out, and they'd be like, oh, let's get fans' comments online. So let's go get man on the street interviews. And, and some part I used to hate that shit, right? Because I'm like, my job is to do this. Mm-hmm. And even if it wasn't my job, like I spent an inordinate amount of time studying this. And so I take the responsibility of being like a curator or gatekeeper, like seriously, right? And responsibly, trying to do it responsibly. And but I know there's people on the outside who are like, oh, these gatekeepers, like they're only playing this corporate backed hip hop, right? And I like when there's a healthy balance of that, because you see it coming up from like the fans because they'll know on the grassroots level, like, yo, nah, like this bigger artist is taking their style, and it bubbles up and you see it, and in that regard, when things are working the right way, that happens. The artist kind of gets pressured. Media sees it, they amplify it, and then the artist will get asked about it when they go on, say, like Angie Martinez's show, right? Like I liked when there was that a cycle and this kind of circular checks and balances, right? Where now it's harder because there's so many different outlets, both legit and sort of like less legit, I'll say, right? 100%. And so it makes it hard because now people are either fighting tooth and nail to just survive, and so they're just taking bits and pieces of the thing that they think will travel fast. And in a way, it's like being hopped up on Skittles, right? Rather than taking the time to like, let me chop up some like a grilled chicken and let's go further with the meal. And so it makes it tough, this idea of how hip hop information travels in hip hop, whether it's influences, noting who stole what or who didn't, and it's been a challenge. Now, it's hit all industries. It hits politics. You 100%. See this with all like the misinformation and fake news. It's a lot of places as things are being like unbundled, and it becomes like an economical decision, right? Where like when there was a magazine, a cover story used to subsidize really other interesting stories on lesser acts that you wanted to know about. Whereas like now each story has to stand on its own with a certain value, and some stories may not stand for that value per the like bandwidth of like the people we employ versus the money we're trying to make. And then some of those stories don't happen as often, or they happen someplace else, but it's, you know, re-reported off of stuff you see on Reddit rather than kind of talking to the direct person. And so,
yeah, it's an interesting thing, because what's all in talking about the snake eating its tail sort of scenario that you were talking about. Now, what's also weird is that it was different, let's say, in some of the earlier examples that we were saying, when you had a New York artist who becomes super big and famous or what have you, and in their need to kind of stay on their toes, you know, they find maybe a rapper from Miami, or they find whatever, and they sort of slowly adopt those styles and turn it into something that makes it interesting. Whereas like now, number one, the scenes aren't as unique as they used to be.
Right.
So a lot of times, much of it all sounds the
or
same.
even just be worried about unique, because I don't know how people take it from how we're saying on the outside. It's not unique. There was a certain sort of either quirkiness or peculiarness or idiosyncrasies to each scene.
Things are
that aren't as different anymore.
The cities are still very different, like culturally at the ground level. But what I've noticed is, be straight up, like even if I'm on tour, you know.
But we'll go to my earlier example. You can go from city to city and everybody looks the same.
Yeah,
like
that's
the styles.
yeah,
the same,
like
right?
I've been in Boise, Idaho, and the openers for a show come out and they are dressed like, you know, any kid in LA or in New York. They sound like Drake, and everything works, but it takes the sheen off of what would have or could have been 10 years before unique about coming from Boise, Idaho, and being that sort of thing. But when it happens online, what is also interesting is like there's, even if someone is accused of stealing, it's not even, because of the need for so much new information, new artists, new music, all these things constantly, nothing is allowed to gestate at any point where that scene even forms in a way where it's solid enough. So people are simply just taking things that came out a day before, and then at that point it's like, who really actually, you know, is the person, like it, because then did that person take it from some whole other thing that you just don't know because the thing wasn't sort of online.
Finished,
and I think the push for, whether it be the fans, whether it be the media, whether it be whoever, to constantly just have things filling this sort of space is also maybe propagating that theft, I guess, or just borrowing. But I wanted to switch a little to talk more about what we were talking about in terms of the gatekeeper space. You've been at MTV, you've been at Vivo. When you're in these rooms, you know, we talk about the right people being in there.
Yeah, for sure.
What sort of responsibility did you feel like you had to do the extra sort of due diligence or to tell the stories properly when those things came in across your desk?
No, it's so funny. I always think about the difference of when I worked at MTV versus the difference when I worked at Double XL, right? When I'm at Double XL, the whole staff is hip-hopped out. So it's so maxed out, this conversation, that then I'm looking for people to have expertises in different lanes, right? Like you be my Southern guy, you know, you kind of be my SoundCloud dude. But it's so maxed out on hip-hop that there's never a sort of like a sense of missing the mark.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's never the fear. So it's more about like executing to the highest degree. Whereas like when you're at MTV, you're fighting for your genre in the same way that like the rock team is fighting for their genre, et cetera, et cetera. And then, you know, so for the longest time it was like me and Shaheem there, right? And so we're writers, but we never had like, for a lot of my tenure there, we never really had like a hip hop segment producer. Right, there'd been some before, like Joseph Patel famously was like a hip hop producer at MTV, launched My Block, which, you know, obviously like an iconic MTV programming. And so I say that to say, like, I remember one time sitting in the newsroom and there's a discussion about the Grammys, and they want to do a breakdown of each genre and categories, and they're planning stuff, and they're just it's an open floor plan, right? So like they're talking about like who to book and who they get to speak on like the best rap category or whatever. And I'm not involved in this meeting, and I'm ear hustling, and I kind of see some of the names they're suggesting. And I'm like, no. I'm like, hey, let me help you guys out. And I crashed the party. Yeah. And I'm literally like, you should get like Bonsu Thompson. At the time, he's music editor Double XL. John Caramanica had only recently kind of been at the Times at that point. And I figured there's a couple other people that I tossed them. And my guys represented really well, and the higher ups were really happy because they were able to have these nuanced conversations that ended up being better than any of the other genre blocks. And I felt an immense sense of pride and also like relief because like I just happened to overhear it. Because if I didn't, it would have happened. It maybe not been as great, but I would have got the call. Yeah. Right, the culture would have called me and be like, "What's going on here?" So that's kind of like the responsibility because a lot of times. When you're like the one of or the few of, you're not being placed in every meeting to be that person. Even when they want you to be the hip hop guy, a lot of times you still have to fight in there. And I'd have people say to me like, "Oh, if I was at MTV, I could have did the stuff you did. I just had to be at MTV." And it's like, there's more to it than that, right? Like you have to be inside, but then also know how to fight inside.
How do you reconcile those two sort of spaces of knowing that you're going to get the call if it goes wrong, whether you were involved in it or not, but then also having to learn to play, which are probably not the same things, certain politics to make sure that you are in those rooms.
Yeah, it's funny. So I love the Double XL one better. I love that experience of just debate every day and just fighting and maxing out on like hip hop knowledge and passion. But I feel the other one is more important, even though I enjoy the Double XL one. Because in some ways they're sort of a template of that. Like, what that's like when you're at the barbershop. Yeah. And it's just a matter of like fine tuning and executing. Whereas like at MTV, it's fighting for it, right? Like it's fighting for it. And it sucks getting the call when people are let down and you're like, yo, but I didn't have anything to do with that. And just imagine like Sway feels, right? Like he's the face of it for a long time, but you would get those calls and you're just like, you just have to eat it, right? And so it's funny, younger me didn't understand what older me now gets,
which is,
and I just said this to somebody recently where I'm like, take that L. You're gonna get a lot of L's. Take the L and eat it, but chew it. Right? Don't just eat it, like chew it and really get a taste for it and figure out what you want from what you're swallowing, right? Like don't just kind of take the L and bag it. Boom, got the L. That was a loss, right? But take it, really chew it and think about like what's happening. So the next time, right? Like, I didn't like the taste of this, right? And so that was MTV in a lot of ways, right? And that's some like in the building shit that a lot of people don't see. They see on the outside, but like on the inside, it's like, yo, you're chewing a lot of L's and you're really trying to figure out how to make this building work and fit the culture in. We tried different things through different years of like, trying to have our own independent meetings where we unite. Like we get like Tim Hotep, who's over in this department, Tuma, who's over in that department, like news come. And, we really try to like, it's just us trying to figure it out. And even that's not as successful all the time.
So being in those places, you always see people complaining on the outside looking in, right? That stuff is not happening. Do you think it's just a matter of time because you have now in every part of American culture and just, global culture in general, people who are graduating who have essentially parents have grown up playing Biggie in the house or understanding a certain level of things culturally, getting into an internship, getting into the mailroom at anywhere, just having a fundamental different understanding culturally so that when they're there, they can represent. Do you think it's just a matter of time that it's going to happen? Or is there still the fight that has to happen every time you get in there?
I think the fight is just going to happen still, And I say that with the caveat of I'm of the opinion that hip hop has never been better. Hip hop's never been better. It's never been healthier. It gets me into trouble with a lot of people when I say that because they're like, "Oh, but we had Jay-Z and this and that." And granted, I think you can make an argument that when we were younger, our age group had bigger stars, but the idea of stardom has changed too.
Yeah,
because pockets are smaller, but just the sheer bandwidth of like talented acts that are doing it right now is incredible, right? Yeah. And just the amount of consumption that I'm doing now, it's just like, it's crazy. And so I say that in that like hip hop is still amazing. It's better than healthy it's ever been. And there's metrics that show that, but companies still have a hard time acknowledging that. And
is it because they fundamentally don't understand it at its core?
I think in some ways it's because hip hop has permeated and penetrated into pop culture writ large, that they see pop culture as this thing that hip hop is separated from, when hip hop is largely driving pop culture too. Yeah. So when I was at Vivo, I remember we had this big announcement like hip hop is the number one consumed genre on our platform, and it was good because it acknowledged and changed some decision making. But in some ways, I was rather dismissive of it because I'm like, it's been that way. It's been that way. And the fact that hip hop is number one on the consumption by the metrics here only shows that it's probably doing twice as better as you think it is, because hip hop is also powering pop music and R&B and it's subsidizing a lot of other genres 100%. In a way that's not getting in return. So like when you talk about like sports economics, right, where they when there's like revenue sharing, right, and people are like, oh, an owner may complain like the Lakers and the Knicks, or the top earning teams are, they're funding teams in Oklahoma, right? Because they're getting the money back. And in a lot of ways, that's hip hop, right? Like hip hop is funding a lot of other genres without getting that same thing in return, because, a pop star wants a verse from DaBaby to make her look hot. Baby don't want that same shit in return. That, you know what I mean? On a scale, it's just not going to work the same. So I say that to say, like, to bring it back to anchor to the question, I think internally a lot of companies have a hard time acknowledging that hip hop is so central to their business plan for a couple of reasons. One, that means that they lose some of the value of their power to somebody else's expertise. And then again, to what I was saying before, it's hard for them to kind of just look just at the sheer kind of scope of things and be like, is hip hop number one? Because Ariana Grande is doing this, not recognizing that like she makes black music, right? And it's coming from black culture, or Bieber makes black music. Huh. And so I think it's kind of the those kind of two things that are wrestling with each other that makes it so hard for them to understand that, to then like, again, chip away at some of their power to give it to somebody else who has expertise. So then it doesn't have to be as much of a fight for somebody in the building to say like, oh, we should be doing this with hip hop. To
dig in a little deeper, so this leads to even, part of the reason that we're doing this is, but do you think that's a personnel issue?
Yeah, of course.
So is it just this simply, there's a certain generation that has like gotten very comfortable in their seats, and they may understand it from a very far away sort of space, that like, oh yeah, the little thing hip hop that they do, because it feels like we're having the same argument that was being had by, let's say, Grammy nominating committees in like 1989 with the same people, like that there's just this fundamental misunderstanding, and it's been decades now of a shift in an understanding of a shift in, in the music landscape, where hip hop has been, like you said, it's been dominant for probably 2 to 3 times as
20
long.
years, easy.
Yeah, as people are saying there is, but now we have the metrics to prove it. But they still don't seem to get it.
And with metric, it's been consolidated too because of streaming. Yeah. Right. So sort of the underground economy of mixtapes, which made it hard to really analyze the true strength. Like now it's all been consolidated, so you can mark and measure it.
Yeah. Yeah, is it just that that those people just haven't left yet?
Yeah, a lot of times too, because it's they'll acknowledge your expertise, but do I want to give away my power at your expertise? No, right? Like it's fun. My expense account is fun. You know what I mean? Like it's cool being able to do this. I think also too, like just there's been a maturation of this being a career, right? Whereas kind of before it's kind of this passion thing. And, you look at some of like the great journalists or great producers or great executives, and it was no different than like an NBA career where it's like, oh man, that was a great 8-year career, where it's like now it's like LeBron's in year 17, right?
Yeah.
And so I think because there's a maturation of this as a field, that makes it so you have people having longer tenures. And that the longer tenure becomes the like, well, I like this salary and I like this or whatever. And it's up. And then, a lot of that goes into like the discussion. And again, I don't want to keep making like bridges into like the Def Jam thing.
No, this is the bridge into the Def Jam.
Because I know we'll get to it, but like that's part of like that bridge to this thing with black executives at labels, right?
Yeah.
And like Billboard did a piece. I think Gail Mitchell did a piece on it like 2 years ago. And even with the Variety piece that came out suggesting Def Jam names, and while we're sitting here talking today, because I started on Twitter being like, here's some names, and it's like, I mean, there's a lot of good candidates for this idea, right? And it doesn't have to be this idea where it's like, there's only but so many people who have CEO experience. When it's like, I mean, you can legitimately come up with 25 names that probably should be interviewed for the Def Jam CEO position, right? And to your point of like personnel, right? Like, I just think we kind of really need to have like a time across a lot of different companies that deal in culture where it's being able to have a strong vision at the top. And I keep tossing it back to like sports examples, but you see it happening there. And it happens in sports because, again, there's been a market shift towards analytics. And also it's been a shift away to not just letting the numbers dictate it, but being able to read the numbers and find patterns. Yeah. And so now, before you would see like Oakland Athletics, what they pioneered like Moneyball, where it's like high on base percentage, and we're going to eliminate bunting, right? Yeah. Where it's like now that there's so much data, you see different teams are doing different things. This team shifts to outfields. This team does this with pitchers. This team is doing this in response to that. And so because of that and sort of that growth, there's an adjustment to like personnel and who they're getting. And you see people getting younger managers. We get younger managers because we have this with the front office. And in the music industry, you see it with like Columbia and Warner Records, right? Going with young CEOs who have A&R experience, and then Pitbull GMs or CEO or COOs that have operations experience. Yeah. And so it's like if you run that same model with Def Jam, you can find tons of people to do. But it's just having that sort of clear-eyed view of doing it. Which, and I'm not saying that's what's happening at Def Jam, but I think when we complain at large as a culture about people from our culture being at these companies that speak to our culture, and how come there's a disassociation with that. I think sometimes those things happen, and a lot of times we wait on like that one person to break through. And for the longest time, it was L.A. Reid, right? L.A. Reid was like the one executive. Yeah. And it makes it a challenge, right? And then he's been a CEO at so many different companies over and over and over again. Whereas like we hope now that like at Def Jam you'll see that. The idea would be like there's not just Jason and Shaheem and MTV News, but there's 4 of them, right? Like, why can't we? If hip hop is happening so fast and so often, why are we going to just have one writer, right? Because now it's like you could have somebody just follow the trap and somebody follow the SoundCloud set. I think it's funny. No matter where I'm at as an editor, I'm always like, I'd love to have somebody just solely on an R&B beat, because I think R&B is so fascinating. It's funny seeing these conversations now about like, oh, R&B's dead, bring it back. It's not. It's just things have changed and the world has changed. Consumption's changed, deliveries change, and this all goes back to like the personnel question and just having the right strategy to put the right people in place, groom and grow. And there's been a dearth of that.
Yeah, you wanted to get to Def Jam, and now we're in a totally different subject in R&B. But we'll get back to Def Jam. So let's dig into this R&B thing a little bit. Do you think that oftentimes none of these conversations are based in fact. Right. They're based in an emotional feel to it. So that being said, we can't argue that there isn't a ton of really solid R&B that has come out over the last couple of years.
Yeah.
There's no argument, Solange at the Table, SZA Control, Daniel Caesar's record. Like, there's a ton of like really linchpin records that have sort of come out and really transformed the space of it. And it starts, I guess, if we go back to sort of the three guys of, basically The Weeknd, Frank, and Miguel coming out in this very short time period and operating not in terms of the way you see them, but operating their back end like rappers. In other words, they moved like indie rappers. They're recording in wherever they can. They are getting beats from, I think the big issue when everybody talks about bring back the 90s R&B space is they forget the 90s R&B is basically buoyed by massive amounts of major label money.
Right.
Like,
and still very strong presence of radio support.
Sure, but even just when we talk about like to scale an R&B group now or back then cost a ton of money because you're dealing with dance rehearsal, hair and makeup all the time, wardrobe styling. Even when you think about what Puff was doing, obviously, even with Jodeci, same thing. Like you needed a massive amount of money to get that to a space. To then obviously go in the studio, make the records, and do all of that, and it just doesn't exist.
Yeah, Dame Dash is one of my favorite quotes about this when he was talking about when he tried to break Christian, that the R&B. I think they were brothers.
The twins.
Yeah, and he was like, moving rap is like crack. R&B is like cocaine.
Yeah.
Right? It's different, right? It's a different hustle. It's a different sale. One is like quick, fast, short money. The other one, it's it's longer and it plays to a different crowd. I love drug references to stuff, by the way. The true economic geniuses are drug dealers. So
they really are. My school put them together with some drug dealers in Pennsylvania. Once, it was a professor put together some drug dealers that he knew around the area that were trying to get out into Pennsylvania that actually had money with MBA students to start businesses together and like had a bunch of successful sort of joints.
That's amazing. But so that's a success. I mean, it also too, I think a lot of times, one, the people who are saying this tend to be older, and I think they're looking at this idea of like the barrel-chested R&B male Lothario who's singing, and that just doesn't exist. And also too, like there was this idea, Frank Ocean's a good one, right? Like there's this idea of like Weeknd, all of them, right? Like that love heartache song where, I mean, topically R&B goes across way more subject matters, right? Like a seat at the table, all these different places. And these albums address a large swath of issues that aren't the idea when they're saying like bring R&B back. I think they want a group, shirt button, just 2 buttons, a lot of navel, chest exposure, the big voice, wooing and women swooning. I think that's what they mean, and that that's, you can make a successful argument that type of R&B, there's a dearth of it, but like R&B just wide. I mean, it's fascinating right now. It's fascinating. Again, the delivery system has changed because of labels, and so because the labels aren't investing in it and delivering that, there's not as many radio stations also then receiving it.
Here's the other sort of piece. Do you think? I was just thinking about this. Do you think that? Okay, I have to jump back. It's a long, not a long question, but R&B is essentially a label for Black pop music.
Right.
It literally is only that because of somebody externally labeling it, because they were like, well, it can't be pop music because it's not white people singing it. So let's make it, rhythm and blues. Then it takes on whatever that sort of is. do you think it's that there is a potential that like, because it is no longer siloed, right? Because the reason why I was thinking about this as we were talking is when we talk about The Weeknd, most people would consider The Weeknd now a pop artist.
Yeah. Rihanna, pop. Beyonce, pop.
But in a different time, they would have been siloed to R&B artists.
Right.
And the best example is Beyonce, because Beyonce for a long time was an R&B icon because she was still coming from sort of the transitional industry where like they held her in this R&B space. But then with the way that just culture shifted with the internet, now you can't hold anything within a category because it'll destroy the category. Right. So is it just that the category is no longer, none of the things even hold weight or make sense to it, right? Because you could have Drake make straight R&B songs, but
which he's argued about with Grammy nominations, right? Like,
but
you're being miscategorized.
Yeah, but so he makes, to me, Drake is one of the biggest and most transformative R&B artists of our generation, probably. But most people they're gonna say he's a rapper, and they're gonna put him in a space that's, especially because of these weird categories now, like rap sung. Yeah. And you're just like, what does that even, sort of mean?
But that all comes at the expense of us not being able to curate our own music and dictate what things are, right? And that's what becomes so important. Again, personnel. Yeah. Right. It becomes right to have the personnel question. Like, this sounds like it's off the path of it, but it makes sense. At least to me, it does. Kendrick getting the Pulitzer Prize for Damn, right? That was supposed to be for To Pimp a Butterfly, right? But they were late, and so them catching up is that. If the correct people were there, or if there was just some more people there, they could acknowledge like what To Pimp a Butterfly was when it was still in the window of that, right? Yeah. And so then like with these categories, like a lot of that is it's retail, right? It's retail to classify that, because me being a journalist, whenever I speak to artists about it, they're like, it doesn't have a genre, it's just good. Artists just think in terms of good and bad.
Yeah, and that's where I'm coming from, is like I look at it from the creator space, and I say, if someone like BJ the Chicago Kid makes R&B, Drake makes R&B,
Beyonce makes R&B, Ariana Grande makes R&B.
She definitely does. She's a little bit of a different thing. Sure. The only reason why I say that,
I actually don't like pop. I really like it to be like top 40.
Well, because pop is never really its own sort of thing. This was a long ago argument that I want to say that it was like Perez Hilton got into an argument with somebody about pop and its sound, and essentially like, no, pop is, let me water down or whitewash an
Black
existing
music.
sound. Yeah, exactly. And that is going to be considered pop music. Ariana is an interesting case, and I only not really single her out, but I remember there was this shift that sort of happened, and this was another one of those things that happened just inside the creative sort of industry, where people realized like, oh, so we can give these songs that we might have given to Seven Streeter or to someone else or Tinashe to someone who is going to scale it at this level that is going to make us extremely sort of rich. The song is an R&B song. Yeah. It is. That's how those people wrote it. Whether it be a Harmony Samuels or whoever. And now it becomes a pop song because of who is presenting it. And I feel like that lets me know that the categories have and always have been BS. And I'm glad that, I think maybe the real crux of the conversation is that the categories exist for just people to sort of make sense out of it, but it doesn't really work anymore.
Yeah, the categories make sense back when you were buying a CD or a cassette and you were going to the store, and it's like, which way is R&B? Because you were looking for a certain sound, right? Which way is pop? Because again, even though Ariana Grande makes R&B, and say Ari Lennox makes R&B, they're different sounds, right? So when I say like, which aisle is R&B, they know what I'm talking about. They know I'm going to go towards like Ari Lennox, right? Sure. And so it made sense from like a consumer standpoint of just like retail transaction. But to your point, for creators, right, that it's just, this is good. and this is bad. And it's funny, again, like sometimes people have such a hard like time stomaching certain information where it's like with Justin Bieber, Tricky Stewart was producing it, The Dream was writing it, like it's what you're saying, right? Like it's coming from R&B DNA, but because he sings it, then it goes to pop, and and that becomes a different conversation or frustration when people say like, well, if a BJ Chicago kid does it, it's not going to do that. And there's still a very real fascination, and maybe it's a media creation, and maybe it's
your guys' fault. It's your guys' fault.
And we can have some blame to that, or maybe it's just human nature where you get fascinated by juxtaposition, right? A white person singing black music. A$AP Rocky, a New York rapper, sounding like he's from Houston, right? It's a juxtaposition is fascinating in a way, right? Because you're like, what I see or what I know, something is being subverted.
So let's dig into that a little bit. The artist versus journalist beef.
Sure,
let's go.
Not beef, different purviews.
Beef. Okay, so something like that specifically. Do you and your cohort ever sort of take, let's say, responsibility or understand the responsibility when it comes to knowing that juxtaposition, that sandpaper is really attractive and tantalizing? But in covering it, in really bigging it up, in giving it the fuel to the fire that it needs to become the whatever thing is, it's going to overshadow things that may be more...
You say traditional?
Not traditional, but let's say culturally, I don't want to say sensitive, but aren't as... or smoother, right? Because they are something that's already existed. Right. There's always the easiest way to just give an example of this is everyone always talks about, let's say, Adele versus Jasmine Sullivan, right? That like Adele, if she wasn't a British, not so much overweight anymore, but let's say when she started overweight white woman that's, singing, essentially trying to sound like Aretha Franklin, that juxtaposition, those really interesting things all put together are the combination of things that make her where she is now versus another singer-songwriter who is also larger, who also, has an amazing voice, but doesn't get the traction simply because she's a known thing. It's an expected idea. Yeah. It's not the spark that's going to write a piece on it because it's just not as, unfortunately, just not as interesting. Right. How do you resolve when the talent is equally there, let's say, but you are going to chase, obviously, the more tantalizing sort of story.
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to what I was saying earlier, right? Like before, certainly, like when there was more urban magazines, a cover story subsidized lesser stories, right? And so you could still find ways to get pages on like a Jasmine Sullivan, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas, and also too, like you knew Jasmine Sullivan, like it was going to be a vibe story on there, right? And now that there's not a Vibe magazine, we all know kind of like the sources, history, and Double XL's publishing less frequently. But in sort of the heydays, you knew like Jasmine Sullivan, that's a Vibe story, and Vibe's going to do a 3-page feature on her. Yeah, and you would probably see her name on the cover, right, as a cover line. Whereas now that things are sort of unbundled in that way, Frank Ocean gets covered in the Source, Double XL, and Vibe, right? Yeah. There's sort of no demarcation of like what goes where. And so they're all fighting for the same thing. It kind of becomes like feast or famine.
And they're all chasing the same blockbuster.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I say it to say like, do journalists kind of see them having culpability in this? No. right? But I do wish that there was, and it's twofold, right? Like in one regard, you can come up with packages, right? Like let's do editorial packages and find ways to like group artists together or find a theme to lift that up, rather if it won't stand alone on its own. So you can do that, whereas like Adele's just gonna get ink to get ink for ink's sake, because again, like it's still like white girl who sings like a black girl. It doesn't go away, right?
Yeah.
And so I think you could do that on one hand, but then again, it's like we're in the age of like metrics and data, and you can have somebody say, well, we don't do this because the audience doesn't want that, and there may be some veracity to that, right? But then again, things get niche, right? And so it's like, this is rnb.com will write about Jasmine Sutherland Go Deep, or like some channel that may be obscure to me on YouTube, but they may have like 500,000 subscribers, and they do the Jasmine Sutherland's interview. So it's just interesting in that regard, and it makes it hard for things to float up to the idea of what the top is.
Yeah.
Because it's that top that like it's Big Ten where everybody can see.
Well, because it's like I look at media,
but I do wish media would be more inventive, and it's funny, like so like right now, being in between like being in the building or not, I every time I'm prepared to go back in, I'm always like, we're going to be more curious. We're going to be curious in an honest way, because sometimes I'll have colleagues and I'll go there and what we talk about in the hallway is interesting, really interesting, and then the output that we put out there is not as interesting.
What do you think is happening?
I think sometimes there's a disconnect from the idea of being a consumer versus being a producer. And anybody who's worked for me over the years, they'll hear me. I used to constantly like kind of pound it into their head, like, when you walk into this room, like, don't forget what it's like to be a consumer, right? Think about all the places you read about, whether it's other music or sports or politics or fashion. What are those things that attract you? Like the way that they're breaking down, like there's a curiosity to things, and it's this is just because it's the top of my head. Like Bad Bunny revealed his album cover on this night show last night, and it's like there's gonna be a ton of places that just do a post on that, where it's like, is there something more curious to it, right? Like it looked like a Stranger Things kind of like lift, and I don't watch Stranger Things, but I'm sure there's somebody there's somebody there who like pop culture savvy enough to watch Stranger Things, is into like Latin trap music to know like
to
Bad
put those
Bunny,
two things together,
but then also works at a place that's cool enough that can amplify it so more people can know, to kind of get that. And it's like, you hope that there's places like that, but having good leadership to be like, all right, we can post this, but let's not just stop after that. Let's go further. Let's be curious, right? Like, let's be really, really curious. Because the thing, if you're going to be in the media, whether it's print, video, blogging, TV, radio, like you're here because you love it. Yeah. So act upon that love. And I think sometimes it gets easy to fall into the trappings of this, like the machinations of like the job part of it. Where it's like, the work, but the to uplift and kind of go higher, it's to tap into the passion.
Yeah. And knowing that when you started your journey with hip hop, you are very far away, right, from the thing, right? You were in Delaware, just like, oh, I love this sort of thing. But now you're in, like we talked about, behind the curtain. Do you think it matters what you think in terms of the art? Do you see yourself still as being a bit of a curator of those things, or are you simply letting it flow through you as it's propagating up its channels? Or are you being extra curious and you're like, hey, there's this weird thing that's happening in Brooklyn or in, whatever. And one person told me about it. No one else knows about it, but I should dig in to see if that's an interesting story. Yeah.
No, I try to be a little bit of both, but I'm more towards the like accelerator, right? Or amplifier, I'll say, right? Like seeing something and looking and to see patterns, right? Like I'm not the like, it's funny. Charles Holmes just wrote this piece about this kid. I think his name's like Rilo Rodriguez. It's this dude who R&B singer, auto-tune, but he lifts like really popular R&B songs. And so like with We Belong Together, Mariah Carey, it's Project Baby, but he like blatantly jacks these songs, so he can't put them on DSPs, so it's only on YouTube.
So similar to what OT Genesis has been doing.
Yeah. So, but whereas OT Genesis is kind of like tongue in cheek, this kid is like real, for real, like. Yeah. Like he remade We Belong Together into this whole song, Project Baby, that's very much about like where he's from. I think in like Alabama. And I don't know Charles personally, but I love his work when he's doing for Rolling Stone, and he's doing the like, one of few fighting that battle, and that's a very like ground level like story. Like he's probably the kid's YouTube channel is probably gonna get shut down now, right? But hopefully this accelerates him getting a job. But I'm never that. I'm like, once like 3 of those happen, right? Like once just let's blow it up and really kind of like dig in to the scene. But also like I'm super protective of the culture, but also want to deliver things the right way when things are like important, right? And so a recent conversation I had about this was Jadakiss is about to come out with his new album on March 6th. I don't know when this is going to come out or not, but in the studio listening to the album, and it's super personal about his former manager Ice Pick J. He also talks a lot about like his relationship and stepping out and some mistakes that he's made, and in a way it's some clamoring for what we always want from Jadakiss, but then it's also like things we never imagined him to do because he's always presented himself as a certain artist, and it's just really fascinating. And I worry that we don't have the media means to translate this work of art anymore, right? Like he'll go on the Breakfast Club, it'll be a fascinating interview, but it'll be such a meta interview about him where he's at the Locks. They'll probably ask him about Griselda, the game, his kids. He'll talk a little bit about Ice Pick J. It'll be so wide and it'll be such a great interview, but the art part of it,
no one's digging in.
And he'll do like a verified on Genius where he'll go in on one, but like the complete body, like it's a fascinating record. I don't know where that lies, like where that conversation lies or what have you. And it's funny because when I first started out in this business, I remember Chuck Creekmer, all hip hop, telling me like, don't ask about the album. What they're saying in the music is the answer's enough. Ask about everything else. And at the time, that was really good advice, and that powered a lot of my success at MTV News. But again, because there's so many outlets and there's so many interviews and podcasts, and sometimes you do these sort of like retrospectives of your whole life, or you're being asked about somebody else or who you worked with. Now it's so far removed from the art music that itself. I think there needs to kind of be a little bit more of that. And I just wonder like, where is that going to come? If that's going to come, or again, like, and sometimes I wonder like, am I naive to think that like there's a wider desire for that? I don't know, because a lot of that conversation happens on like Twitter, right? Like we're all going to listen to it.
Yeah, but we will all just speculate about what it is. We won't get the in-depth conversation to really kind of go through the. But if mindset. You tune in,
when is this dropping?
It'll drop Tuesday.
What's Tuesday's date?
It's the beginning of March.
Okay, so but March 4th. If you turn into Build by Yahoo, I'll be interviewing Jadakiss. I'm going to try and get that conversation.
All right, awesome. Yeah, let's do it. Okay, so let's shift a little bit. So you got on Twitter, started throwing some names out about who should take over the helm of Def Jam.
Yeah.
So let's start. Why? Def Jam is very far removed from what we remember Def Jam when we were growing up.
Sure.
So why does it matter?
I think, one, again, like what I was saying earlier, this is how you know we've been talking so long. It's so self-referential. What I was saying 16 minutes ago. But Def Jam matters in a way that other hip-hop labels don't. Like, it's not a JV. It's a fully staffed, functioning hip-hop label.
Yeah,
full stop.
Period.
You know what I mean? And other labels are having great success. Interscope's having great success with hip-hop. Atlantic's having great success with hip-hop. Epic's doing a great job. Columbia is doing a great job. Empire's obviously kicking ass. But, Def Jam is iconic, and it's a North Star for us and for the culture. And so it matters in a way. Like, we're sitting here, I got this book here, right? This Def Jam 25 book, Rizzoli. Like, there's not other hip-hop labels that have this type of beautiful mainstream coffee table book about the history. And so I just think it matters because there's one, a reverence towards it, but I also think it's a bellwether to the health of what's going on with hip hop. And I also think it can mint stars in a way that not being associated with other labels can do, right? Like Def Jam is a brand unto itself. Yeah. And the previous regime, you know, they tried to tap into that. But the acts didn't match it to do it, and maybe it was a little bit of the cart ahead of the horse. But you know, Def Jam is famous in and of itself. To then be signed to it matters, right? And you have debates about whether people should be signed there or not, right? They're not a Def Jam act, right? And that's good. That means there's buy-in from the audience because they feel like they have a stake in this. No, they're not Def Jam. They're not being like, oh man, that person shouldn't have signed that Atlantic, right? They shouldn't have been the TUG, right? It's different because again, those are like JVs doubling as crew, whereas this it's something different. So I just think it's important, and so. Obviously, Paul Rosenberg stepped down from Def Jam. Variety did this piece talking about what's going on with Def Jam, and then at the end, they throw out some names of some people. Some obviously were like Hail Marys, some were like No Chance, some were interesting, and so I just wanted to add on to that discussion. So I threw a couple names out there, and it like what good tweets do when you can catch a good tweet.
Yeah,
it leads to a wider conversation.
So. Without getting into the names, because I feel like most people won't know them, so it doesn't matter.
But you'll be surprised, though. Like,
if you were running Def Jam, because you're obviously selecting names because you think that they have a sense of what to do sort of correctly, right. Which means that you inherently have some suggestions as
Sure.
So what do you think, at its core, it would need to get back to in order to kind of find its footing again?
So first, I was people know these names.
Oh, yeah,
because it was an interesting mix of industry professionals, fans, and then and then executives in my DMs because they didn't want to be out loud talking about this. But no, I just obviously first and foremost, there's the repertoire. There's a repertoire of acts and just breaking new acts, and so. They need to increase the velocity of that. Undisputed, the attempt that they did last year, that was the try to do it. I think that was an experiment of really doing an attempt of development in real time when a lot of them maybe should have been behind the curtains and maybe faucet dripped out rather than in kind of this full spout of like all these different artists. But also, what's interesting about like labels? Like, I mean, a label's a hit business, right? You sign one act that changes the label's fortunes. Columbia looks like they're on fire because Lil Nas X. Yeah. Boom. And then you shuffle in like Polo G and Little TJ, and it's like, oh man, we have this big kid who's minting money in Lil Nas X, but then we have credibility with Polo G, and then Little TJ is probably star in the waiting, right? Or in the making, right? So it's like they look like they have it going on. Yeah. If Lil Nas X didn't blow, then it doesn't put the other two artists in their correct space. So a lot of that hit driven, some of it's like I can't even explain it. You have some good people who can kind of create the foundation for that, right? And so like at Columbia, like Ron Perry, he's a publishing executive, right? So he comes from that space of like trying to put together records. How do we put these records together to amplify them? And so I think that speaks well to Columbia rebounding what they've been able to do, and just aggressively going after younger acts, but that make kind of sense for.
But do you think we hold them to too high of a standard because
being Def Jam? Yeah, for sure.
Because at the end of the day, they have had successful acts over the years, but those acts, like we said, aren't necessarily Def Jam acts, right? Sure. They're Def Jam acts because they're signed to Def Jam, but they're not Def Jam acts. And is it because we don't want to accept what those, like? No, I mean, because if you were to take those three acts and put them on Def Jam, right? I don't think...
and I think that's a lot of what happened with Undisputed, right? I think there was a lot of acts that people had a hard time accepting that they were signed to Def Jam. And because also there's this idea that like you have to it's a benchmark. You have to do more to get signed to Def Jam. So yeah, but that's the challenge of the new executive's job, right? Like, and I was saying this. So I had a lot of different back and forths. Obviously, like I thought ours was really interesting, and that's what led to this conversation. But you saying like the idea of like a producer, somebody who knows how to make records end to end, right? Like it has to be somebody that has like a really strong creative entrepreneur background or a creative execution background to get around the legacy of Def Jam, because they have to do stuff to create. I don't say new legacy, but you have to acknowledge the legacy of the label, but not be handcuffed to it. And I think a cheat code around that is for somebody that has to be a little bit public facing, right? Like I think you kind of have to almost be a star too yourself, because you have to speak for the label. That hedges and buys you a little bit of time as well. And again, because we care about it so much, you almost have to do sort of a state of the union. Like I would like this person to do an interview once a year, maybe explain what the fuck's going on. And that may seem frivolous, but this label matters in a way that doesn't. But you're so again, like Undisputed. So Columbia did the draft, right? And it was Polo G, Little TJ, and somebody blue. I forget, the name is escaping me. But I liked it. It was a more nimble thing of introducing 3 artists, and it seemed very repeatable. They haven't done it again, but I feel like they could do it again. Undisputed was just such a big, heavy, loaded attempt. And when you misfire, it's hard to reload, right? And, imagine if they did Undisputed Volume 1, 2, 3, and broke it up and staggered it in a way that, they could learn from it and go. Because out of all those acts, I mean, they didn't have one Little TJ, right? Like, there's not one of those acts. There's like 30 of them that matched Little TJ's. And you need that because there's a lot of those acts that were talented, but people are judging that talent against the brand and legacy of Def Jam, and they're trying to reconcile to see if it matches up or not. And it's unfair for the artist, but it's a huge challenge for the executives.
I haven't seen this. I didn't see this in the thread, so I'm just going to see what happens now. Should we give Def Jam back to Rick Rubin?
I mean, so my gut says no right away.
Okay.
But I also realize, like, I don't want to be arrogant in saying that, like, Rick Rubin can't do anything he wants to get. But
well, I mean, I'm just, when I think about what you were talking about, having somebody who is very, has evolved, is very centered in sort of this space and direction that he wants to go, is clearly tapped in at Shangri-La to all manner of young, new artists going through. He was at Columbia when Adele popped. He obviously was a part of that project. Like, so we know he knows how to scale very big things. He's been a part of a bunch of other projects.
And for all that reason, I would be arrogant to say no, but I'm going to say no.
Because you want somebody new.
I want somebody new.
But if he was at the helm, and then you get some of those other names that can be like, go out and go do.
But that's happened before. Like, I want it to be transformative. Like, put somebody new, and put the Rick. This can sound funny, but put the Rick Rubin of operations as the number 2 to be a COO or a GM, who's like the Tom Corson, who went to Warner Records from RCA, and then get somebody new, and they'll be experienced. They'll be new to that role, but they won't be new in the game. But then also get a Black or Latin man or woman, right? Like, because again, Def Jam is culture. It's culture, and have that. And that's not to say that, like, there was a failing with Paul or Joey or Steve Bartles. Like, they were all successful in their own right with their tenure. But I also think at this point, like, let's get a return to somebody of color at a hip hop label to speak for the culture, because there's enough candidates. There's enough. I had somebody who added me and was like, because I initially named 3 names, like Tuma, Shaka Zulu, and Betty Pooh, and I only meant that to be like, here's 3 like that I feel like are missing, and then people were like, well, what about women? So, I start naming a couple women, and again, I honestly think you can come with 25 candidates 100%. To speak with. Speak with to find out, to synergize an idea of a vision that executives want from UMG, but also to see if it matches up with what a candidate wants for their vision, and then give them autonomy. But so somebody on Twitter was like, how about Bazoma St. John? And granted, as ill as an executive as she is, she's outside the music industry.
Yeah.
And to me, that's there's enough talented people in the music industry already that can have a shot before you then go with somebody who's outside. Like, I just think there's a bunch of talented people. But again, because hip hop is our core import into this country and what we sample to make it and do it, like, I'd like to see an executive at the head of that who reflects that.
Do you think that whoever gets there, the only reason why I always mention someone like a Rick Rubin or someone just in that sort of space is because at their core, they're really good A&R men, and they can, like, do you think the industry in general needs to throw numbers away for at least a little bit? Not so much, because I've been in a lot of conversations, I've been in a lot of meetings, and the Moneyball way in which a lot of record labels are operating, I feel like is very dangerous for, especially when it relates to hip hop, but when it comes to minting stars, long term is just not going to yield the quality that we want at the height that we want, because they're only worried about, getting bases rather than hitting home runs. Right. And in order to hit a home run, you can't be paying attention to like these numbers in the same way, because so many of the people, I've always make this argument, like Kendrick, Cole, Drake, like these people that we have up at the top, Big Sean, none of these people on paper worked day one.
Right.
It was a long time of work.
Right.
It was artist development at its basic, most core level of putting out mixtapes, testing things out, doing the show for 10 people, that not working, then, okay, figuring out the music here, cool, now we're doing a show for 50 people, and doing that scale brick by brick that has these people minted now. Yeah. There are very few straight Instagram to, stardom sort of people. Right. It's like Lil Nas X is obviously big, but Lil Nas X can't do an arena.
Right, for sure.
Right? So there's this interesting balance where you're like, he's big, but he's not doing a venue that Kendrick can do.
But it becomes interesting, right? It's like, because with Cole, Drake, and Kendrick, like, they're all over 30 now. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but it took that. But that's what I'm saying. It took that long.
Yeah, but if you look at the, but it took that long, yes. But also, it was a development system, and I'll put that in quotes, right? Because I know everybody's like, artist development doesn't exist anymore. It may not exist in sort of that Motown way that I think that's the archetype what people think about.
Yeah, but it exists. Top Dog is developing artists.
Yeah, it exists, but it's different, and some of it's behind closed doors. Sometimes it's like, we're going to incubate you in public a little bit. And the idea of mixtapes was so crucial because there's not as much pressure to do a single, right? So you don't have to make a song that justifies return on investment with a mixtape. And you can just really find your sound and develop something that's at the core of like who you are, right? Yeah. This stands for who I am before I take off and I do this other project. And you get that, like, the fans are like, oh yeah, that's cool, but I really like this, right? Like, you always get that from your favorite artist. Where it's like, now it's funny because, I have these meetings with new artists and I'll put out something and I'm like, all right, okay, so this has a barcode, obviously it's like it's going on DSPs, like, is this a mixtape? Like, no, it's not a mixtape. Okay, so it's your debut. No, it's not my debut. All right, cool. What is it? It's a project, right? And so, and although like they're hedging with that, but it's constructed more like an album rather than a mixtape, right? There is an idea of like trying to reach for, again, something that kind of like justifies the impact of like why they brought you in for the return. And so that makes it tough to this idea when you sign people and like, are they right or not? Because it's like, to your point, right? Like, so all those three guys are in their 30s let's say if Def Jam right now had their marquee young artists, let's say if it was Lil Pump, Russ, and Kamaya, right? Like, would people look at Def Jam and be like, "Yo, like they got it going on"? Right?
No, that's what that's what we're kind of talking about before. Is like I do think that it is something more. It is more granular than that. It would be basic. It would almost have to be a new. My recommendation would be to find a JV joint venture, and then build a crew out of it.
Yeah,
and have a marquee set of a few artists. Let's say if we talk about Dreamville, let's say Dreamville did a JV over there.
Yeah. That's a really good example.
It could because it could it's just moving through the universal system.
Yeah.
Just move over from Interscope to Def Jam, but then you have a solid idea.
Mm-hmm.
You'd have to convince them to figure out how to do Dreamville, Def Jam sort of jackets and not get into the argument that Dame did. But it would need to be something like that where you can, because again, Def Jam was what it was because it was an aspirational idea for the up and coming rapper. Yeah, and it was a beacon in the way that, let's say, Polo and Ralph Lauren is in the fashion space for what the culture could be and identifies as, and you need to put that sort of thing there to get people wanting to go back to it. I agree with you 100%, and I think I think the idea of why Dreamville would work is I think Def Jam works a certain way, and I think people have this expectation when you're signed there and you come out like you're ready, right? There's not the I'm putting out projects. No, you're putting out albums and it's go time, right? The problem is to sign somebody who's at that regard, they would have to hold off because they're getting offered deals from other labels sooner and sooner and sooner. So either Def Jam has to find those people really early, and then keep them under wraps and then do it. So it's to your point, somebody, a producer or A&R. I also think somebody with the promo background, Def Jam works the Def Jam acts that really historically have worked big radio support, big radio records. You can argue the importance of radio relative to streaming. It's changed the importance of radio, but radio is still very important, and having a hit record on radio is just different than streaming, right? So the idea of what's the record? Apollo G and Lil TJ, Pop Out, right? Yeah.
Pop Out was huge on streaming. It wasn't the same on radio, and maybe that's the difference in people know that song more than they know those two acts, right? And that's what I'm talking about, this brand of Def Jam and what it means to be signed there. And I think how it works and how it's constructed, I think radio kind of still matters. So I think it's a certain type of artist that they have to get. How do they get that artist in the competition of people signing sooner and earlier? Again, that's why I'm not running it. I just have suggestions on the outside, but I do think that somebody with a radio promo background may be just as interesting as an A&R person or a producer.
Yeah, I think it needs all of that, but I do ultimately think that someone like Ebe and Cole or what they're doing in Dreamville, and obviously what Top Dog and Punch, when we think about what's working, what new brands are flying a flag that sort of makes sense, it still comes down to investing in those two places specifically. The people that they have there they weren't in a bidding war to get those people.
Right.
It was recognizing real raw talent at a certain level and putting in the cool, you're in the studio now forever until this thing becomes what it is, and it's not coming out until it becomes that sort of thing.
And even the way they did it, with a compilation.
Oh yeah, well the Dreamville compilation specifically. Yeah,
I'd like to see Def Jam go back to being super influential with soundtracks. right? Like, and doing soundtracks, I'd like to see Def Jam do soundtracks the way that Dreamville did the compilation, where they open the doors to everybody.
That
right?
might be also an interesting sort of play.
Where it's because like
start in the soundtrack.
Yeah, because like you can because Def Jam used to have. I mean, they used to do soundtracks where it was like Def Jam presents this movie soundtrack because again, the brand of Def Jam meant so much. But doing that Dreamville compilation. Blueprint, but with the soundtrack, where you break some of your artists, but you also pair them with known artists, right? You have, but known artists outside of Def Jam. Get a Big Sean record on there and do that, and so then you can attach to this cultural moment and this zeitgeist that's beyond yours. To then together they hit and it blows, right? Like I'd like to see stuff. I just want somebody who, and I think that's why sometimes I point to like a creative entrepreneur background, right? Like who's somebody who's going to think some way different, and that's why I thought like Shaka's so interesting because he managed Ludacris, which that's experience in and of itself, was inside the building at the Def Jam, ran a successful JV where he had to put out other artists that I'm not just banking on superstar appeal, but like we have to make records and get this out. So really like frontline operating like a line experience, and then. Spotify, like being at Spotify, that sort of polished his resume because now he has an inside look at analytics and what's the capacity for records to blow or not. So I just think put all that together. If he wanted the job, like I think he's a candidate where it's like it's yours to lose. There's a lot of other people that have those different things, but it's like that kind of combination of being able to look at things a little bit askew and be like, all right, these are the things that we're going to do to create competitive advantages that we may not have anymore because the playing field is more level than it ever has been.
I think whoever takes it over, the first question they need to answer, and this is just in all business, but especially for a brand that's established, is its why. Like at its core, why should Def Jam exist in the next decade? And what are the cultural tenets that it can sort of live by, and then establish all the stuff around it, because otherwise, again, it has rocked and had success here and there, and you have these people that are on it, but it doesn't feel enough like a thing where it has been connected to the culture as it has been in the past. But to wrap this up, I have one last question for you. What have you learned from hip hop that you use in your everyday life? It could be business-wise, relationship-wise, spiritually, anything. What is something that you've taken out from being in the culture so long that you kind of apply to every day? Not literally every day, but just everyday life.
No, it's funny. Hip hop is there's a very like religious feeling to it, right? This like conventional thing that brings so many people together from different backgrounds and different experiences, and it's like I'm not a very like devout follower of a particular religion, but like hip hop makes me feel that way. It's the closest thing I've had to like prior to like getting married and starting a family, right? And but it's that sort of like core foundation goes through everywhere, where it's like I go at jobs and I collect people, right? Like, oh, you're mine, I got you. Like we're riding it out whether we're here or not. And I'm fighting for you. I'm providing for you in ways that I can, or whatever my resources are. But I do that way with family too, where it's like friends become like family, and everybody becomes close. And for me, like that's strictly from like hip hop, and a lot of that is born. It's born of like a very specific like my entry point into hip hop, where it wasn't. It was hard to get mixtapes, right? Like it was hard to get mixtapes. News was coming every month when the magazine came in the mailbox, right? Not like just checking on Twitter and seeing everything and, different songs from every day. So it's like that it now feels like, everybody's a hip hop head, but like at my stage of like adolescence as like a early teen, it's like, oh, I'm the hip hop guy. And we all may like rap songs, but like I'm the hip hop guy. It's different the way I consume. And so everybody had that, and it brings you closer, especially when you meet like another person who's obsessive as you are, and it's like you're like, oh, you know the name of Dr. Dre's publishing company? Because you're looking at the credits. And so that thing of just like tightening and bringing people together, like that's the way I feel like I kind of like coach my life, right? Like my family's family with these people, and this is how I feel about people I work with who then become family. And you know, I have this guy I used to work with, Rudy Correa at Vivo, and sometimes he calls me and he's like, oh man, he's like, you know, I'm sorry to bother you. I know you're like with your family. And I'm like, you are my family. Like, don't be sorry. Like you're my family too. So like, I'm here for you, you know? And but that to me is like, that's straight from hip hop.
Yeah. Ain't nobody fucking with my clique, right?
Click.
Thank you for the time, man.
My brother, I appreciate it.
Yeah. Think like a rapper.
Hey, ad lib.
Once again, thank you to my guest, Jayson Rodriguez. And make sure you follow at Think Like a Rapper on Instagram, and check the video for the podcast out on the YouTube channel for Kids in the Hall. KIDZINTHEHALL. Peace.